miserably, fool! You thought you could stop me from getting the share in the company?
Oh my God!
Unaware that his mother had hidden a clause granting her 50% of his empire the moment his child was born, and had already signed agreements with Chinese investors to sell everything for billions, Emeka boarded his flight to Abuja with nothing but routine business on his mind, believing his mother's cruelty toward his pregnant wife Amara was simply about tribal pride and old-fashioned snobbery. To him, Ngozi was difficult, controlling, perhaps even bitter, but still his mother. The woman who had raised him, shaped him, and built the family name alongside his late father. But as his private jet lifted off the Lagos runway, he had no idea that back at their Banana Island mansion, his mother was dismissing every single house staff member with cash and cold instructions not to return until the following evening, clearing the stage for what she'd planned for months. To eliminate the village girl, carrying the golden ticket to billions, making it look like a tragic accident, and disappearing to her ancestral village as the wealthiest woman in Igbo land. Nor did he know that when his emergency meeting was cancelled mid-flight, and he turned his Range Rover back toward home with a knot of dread tightening in his chest, he would walk through the back garden gate just in time to hear his own mother's voice, cold, venomous, triumphant, confessing her plans to a screaming, petrol-soaked Amara. "That child in your belly is worth 50 billion naira to me, but you're worth nothing but the match that lights you." But what happens when the billionaire who thought he understood power discovers that his entire empire was built on theft, fraud, and the broken bodies of innocent people his parents destroyed 20 years ago? When the humble village teacher he married, the woman enduring daily humiliations with grace and silence, turns out to be the daughter of a man his family drove to suicide, carrying not just his child but a decades-old curse that promised his own blood would bring him to justice? And what will Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo does when she realizes that the woman she's about to burn alive has already stripped her of every kobo, every scheme, every twisted dream, and that her son has been watching from the shadows, recording every word? Amara Okonkwo once believed in the power of patience. Her marriage to Emeka was supposed to be a miracle, the kind of story village girls whispered about in Enugu, where a soft-spoken teacher with no family wealth somehow captured the heart of one of Nigeria's most powerful billionaires. The wedding had been beautiful, almost surreal, with Lagos society whispering behind their champagne glasses about the nobody from nowhere who had somehow enchanted Chukwuemeka Okonkwo. But marriage had not been a fairy tale. It had been a slow, suffocating descent into invisibility. She had become a ghost in the Banana Island mansion, one who cooked meals no one thanked her for, smiled through venomous remarks about her village manners, and apologized silently every time Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo, her mother-in-law, reminded her exactly how far beneath the Okonkwo name she truly was. The humiliations came in waves, relentless and calculated. Cold leftovers placed before her while the rest of the family feasted on jollof rice and suya. Accidental shoves on the marble staircase that sent her stumbling, hand flying to her swollen belly in terror. Loud conversations conducted in her presence, as if she were furniture. A proper wife knows her place. A proper wife comes from a proper family. This one, she bewitched him. Mark my words. The night Emeka left for Abuja, Amara didn't cry. She stood by the window of their bedroom, her hand resting instinctively on the curve of her belly, 6 months pregnant now, her body swollen with the first grandchild of the Okonkwo dynasty, and watched the taillights of his convoy disappear into the Lagos night. The storm clouds gathering over the lagoon mirrored something building inside her chest, something she couldn't name yet. Before he left, Emeka had done something strange. He'd pressed an envelope into her hands, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that frightened her. "Don't open this unless something happens to me," he'd whispered, kissing her forehead, then her belly. She'd felt the weight of secrets in that kiss, the burden of things unsaid. But she smiled, nodded, and tucked the envelope into her dresser drawer. Love always wins, she told herself, the same prayer she whispered every night. Patience conquers cruelty. Grace softens hearts. She believed it with every fiber of her being. even as her body bore the bruises of accidents, and her spirit carried the weight of 1,000 small deaths. What Amara didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her mother-in-law's hatred had nothing to do with tribal pride or family honor. Weeks earlier, in the dead of night when the mansion slept, Ngozi had sat in her private study surrounded by documents that glowed in the lamplight like prophecies of wealth. Her late husband's signature was there, scrawled across contracts he'd signed in his final days when pain medication made the world soft and her whispers seemed so reasonable. The clause was buried deep, written in legal language designed to hide its true intention. Upon the birth of the first child to Chukwuemeka Okonkwo, 50%, 50% of all shares, assets, and controlling interests in Okonkwo Tech Enterprises shall transfer automatically to the Okonkwo Family Trust, administered solely by Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo until her death or resignation. She traced those words with her finger, her perfectly manicured nail tapping each syllable like a drumbeat of victory. 50 billion naira. Maybe more, depending on the current valuation. And she'd already made her arrangements. Phone calls conducted in rapid Igbo to investors in Shanghai, men who asked no questions and paid in offshore accounts that disappeared like smoke. The child's birth would trigger the transfer. The signatures would be executed within 72 hours. And then, she'd be on a private jet to her ancestral village, returning not as the widow of a tech mogul but as the wealthiest woman in living memory, building schools and hospitals in her family name, erasing decades of struggle with a single transaction. There was just one problem. One insignificant, expendable problem named Amara. The phone call had come that Thursday morning, Emeka's business trip to Abuja, an emergency government contract that required his immediate presence. Ngozi had smiled as she poured her son's coffee, encouraging him to go, praising his dedication. And the moment his convoy disappeared from view, she began moving with the precision of someone who had planned this for months. She dismissed the cook first, handing her an envelope of cash. Take the day off.
Tomorrow, too.
I'll handle meals. The driver next. The housekeeper. The gardener. One by one, she cleared the mansion, her smile never faltering, her voice honey-sweet with false generosity. By noon, the sprawling Banana Island estate sat empty except for two women, a matriarch dressed in practical clothing, her expensive George wrapper left hanging in the closet, and a pregnant teacher tending to bougainvillea in the garden, unaware that she had just hours left to live. The garden had always been Amara's sanctuary. Among the blood-red blooms and violent purple petals of the bougainvillea, she could breathe and could pretend the mansion wasn't a prison. She knelt carefully, her belly making the movement awkward, and pruned dead leaves with gentle fingers. The sun was setting, painting the Lagos sky in shades of amber and fire. She didn't hear the Ngozi approach. She only felt the sudden shift in the air, the way prey senses a predator before seeing it. When she turned, her mother-in-law stood there, no longer draped in gold and silk but wearing simple dark clothing. Practical clothing. And carrying something behind her back. Amara, Ngozi said, her voice almost kind. We should talk. The conversation began calmly enough. Questions about the pregnancy, how the baby was moving, whether Amara was eating well. And then, like a blade sliding between ribs, Ngozi's tone changed. Do you know what you cost me, Amara? Do you know what that child in your belly means? And then she told her everything. The clause. The 50 billion naira. Chinese investors. The one-way ticket to the village. Every word was a hammer blow, and Amara's legs weakened beneath her, her hand flying to her belly as if she could shield her unborn child from the monstrosity of what she was hearing. That child in your belly is worth 50 billion naira to me, Ngozi said, her eyes empty of anything resembling humanity. But you're worth nothing but the match that lights you. She brought the petrol container from behind her back. Amara tried to run, but she was 6 months pregnant, and Ngozi was blocking the garden gate. The screaming began as petrol splashed across her dress, soaking the fabric, the chemical smell burning her nostrils. She stumbled backward, clutching her belly, begging, "Mama, please, the baby, please, I'll leave, I'll disappear, just don't hurt the baby." But Ngozi's face was stone, her hands steady as she produced the matches. What neither woman knew was that 1 hour earlier, in the back of his Range Rover speeding through Lagos traffic, Emeka had received the lab results that changed everything. The envelope had arrived 2 days prior, sealed, marked confidential, from the private medical laboratory where he'd been secretly sending samples of Amara's food for weeks. He'd suspected something was wrong when he'd noticed how thin she'd become, how her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. And now, staring at the words on the paper, arsenic detected, 0.8 milligrams per serving, consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning *, his entire world tilted on its axis. His mother. His own mother had been poisoning his wife. When his phone rang with news that the Abuja meeting was cancelled, he didn't question it. He simply told his driver to turn around. And when he called the mansion and received no answer, when he called the house staff and heard that Ngozi had dismissed them all with cash and instructions not to return until evening, the knot of dread in his chest became a fist of certainty. He parked at the back gate, the one used by service vehicles, and entered on foot. And that's when he heard it, his mother's voice, cold and sharp as broken glass, echoing across the compound. And beneath it, Amara's screams. He moved toward the garden like a man in a nightmare, his phone already out, already recording, because some part of him understood that what he was about to witness would require proof that his own mind would be rejected as impossible. And then he saw them, his mother circling his pregnant wife, petrol-soaked ground between them, matches in hand. His entire world shattered in that moment. Every memory of childhood, every story about family honor and legacy, every lie he'd been told about who the Okonkwo's really were. But he didn't move. Not yet. His fingers typed a text to his private security. "Come to the house.
Garden. Now."
Silent approach. Because he needed them to see this too. He needed witnesses to the death of everything he thought he knew. And then, just as Ngozi raised the matches to strike, something impossible happened. Amara stopped begging. She stood straight despite the petrol soaking her dress, despite her body trembling with terror, and looked her mother-in-law dead in the eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations, the power of ancestors who had been silenced but not defeated. "Mom Ngozi, you can burn this body, but what you don't know is that 3 days ago, Emeka took me to his lawyer." And then she told her own truth. The changed will. The irrevocable trust for the child. Amara was the sole trustee until the child turned 21. The arsenic discovery. The hidden cameras throughout the house. Which means even if you kill me today, even if you kill this baby, you'll never see 1 kobo of his money. You'll die poor and disgraced, and he has cameras everywhere in this house. Mama, everywhere. For a heartbeat, the garden held its breath. Then Ngozi's face collapsed from shock into something feral, animalistic. She lunged forward to strike the match anyway. Because if she couldn't have the money, she would have revenge. And that's when Emeka exploded from the shadows with a roar that shook the heavens. Amara had learned to make herself small. In the 6 months since moving into the Banana Island mansion, she had perfected the art of disappearing while standing in plain sight, of swallowing words that would only earn her sharper cruelties, of smiling through humiliations that cut deeper than any blade. This morning was no different. She sat at the breakfast table, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, watching as the household staff served Chief, Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo first, always first, piling her plate high with akara, fried plantains glistening with palm oil, and perfectly seasoned jollof rice left over from last night's dinner. The aroma made Amara's stomach clench with hunger, but she said nothing. She never did. When the young housekeeper finally approached her with an apologetic smile, the plate she placed before Amara contained yesterday's cold EBA and a thin soup with more water than vegetables. Ngozi watched this exchange over the rim of her teacup, her eyes glittering with satisfaction behind the steam. "Amara," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You're looking rather thin. Are you sure you're eating properly? A woman in your condition needs nourishment." The irony was a knife twist, and they both knew it. Amara forced a smile, the same smile she'd worn for 6 months like armor that protected nothing. "I'm fine, Mama. Thank you for your concern." Across the table, Emeka glanced up from his tablet, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He'd been distracted lately, always on phone calls she couldn't quite hear, studying her with an intensity that felt like worry but never quite became action. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, returning to his screen. The moment passed like all the others, witnessed but not confronted, seen but not stopped. After breakfast, as Amara climbed the marble staircase to her bedroom, Ngozi appeared behind her with the silent grace of a predator. "Let me help you, my dear," she said, reaching for Amara's elbow. Her grip was iron disguised as assistance, her fingers digging into flesh as she guided Amara upward. On the 7th step, Ngozi's hand shifted, just slightly, just enough, and suddenly Amara was stumbling forward, her pregnant body lurching toward the unforgiving marble. She caught the railing with both hands, her heart hammering against her ribs as she steadied herself, gasping. Behind her, Ngozi made a soft sound of concern. "Oh my, how clumsy of you. You really must be more careful, Amara. In your condition, a fall could be—" She paused, letting the word hang like a noose. Tragic. That afternoon, while Ngozi entertained her society friends in the parlor, their voices carried through the mansion's high ceilings like poison in the air. Amara passed by with a tray of tea she'd been asked to prepare, and the conversation didn't pause. "A village girl," one woman said, her tone thick with disdain. "No family name, no proper breeding. I heard she didn't even have a dowry worth mentioning." Ngozi's laughter was wind chimes made of razors. "What can one do? My son was bewitched." But these things have a way of correcting themselves, don't they? Nature knows what belongs and what doesn't. Amara's hands trembled as she set down the tray, but her face remained serene, empty, the mask she'd learned to wear so well it had almost become her skin. Later that night, alone in her bedroom while Emeka worked late in his study, Amara stood before the mirror and placed both hands on her belly. The baby kicked, a flutter of life against her palms, and something inside her cracked. Not breaking, but shifting. She whispered into the darkness, her voice so soft it was almost prayer. "Your grandmother doesn't love us yet, but she will. Love always wins." But even as she spoke the words, she tasted their bitterness. Because deep down, in a place she was too afraid to examine, Amara was beginning to understand that some people were not softened by grace. They were emboldened by it. And patience, for all its virtue, could become complicity if you waited long enough. Outside her window, Lagos glittered like broken glass under the moon, beautiful and sharp and utterly indifferent to the small tragedies unfolding in mansions where wealth couldn't buy mercy. The dramatic irony cut deep, slicing through the quiet like a blade she couldn't see but could feel in every breath. Because while Amara whispered her prayers of hope, 3 floors below in her private study, Ngozi was booking a one-way ticket to her village, scheduled for 2 weeks after the baby's due date, and smiling at the thought of 50 billion reasons why love would never matter at all. The study was dark except for the amber glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across mahogany furniture that had belonged to Ngozi's late husband. She sat alone, the mansion silent around her at 2 a.m, and spread the documents across the polished wood like a fortune teller reading cards that promised wealth beyond imagination. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as her finger traced the clause buried on page 17 of her husband's will, the words she had whispered into his morphine-hazed consciousness during those final weeks when pain made him pliable and her voice was the only anchor he had left. Upon the birth of the first child to Chukwuemeka Okonkwo, 50% of all shares, assets, and controlling interests in Okonkwo Tech Enterprises shall transfer automatically to the Okonkwo Family Trust, administered solely by Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo. She had read these words 1,000 times, but tonight they tasted different, sweeter, more real. because the village girl was 6 months pregnant now, which meant Ngozi was 3 months away from becoming the wealthiest woman in Igbo land. She pulled her phone closer and scrolled through the encrypted messages from her contact in Shanghai. Mr. Chen didn't ask questions about family dynamics or moral complications. He asked about valuations, transfer timelines, and wire instructions. The acquisition price had been negotiated over months of careful back-channel communications. The entire Okonkwo Tech Enterprises package for $8 billion to be paid in 3 installments across accounts in Singapore, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands. Once the birth triggered the automatic transfer, once her control of the family trust was legally irrevocable, she would have 72 hours to execute the sale before anyone could challenge it. 72 hours to sign, transfer, and disappear. She typed a message in careful English, her thumbs moving slowly across the screen. Timeline confirmed. Transfer will occur automatically upon birth. Estimated 3 months from today. Prepare documentation. The reply came within minutes, despite the time difference. Understood. Legal team ready. Payment structure in place. Awaiting your signal. She smiled, the expression cold and precise as a surgical incision. Leaning back in her chair, Ngozi's gaze drifted to the photograph on her desk. A family portrait taken 2 years ago, before Emeka had met that girl. In it, her son stood tall beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression confident and untroubled.
That was before Amara had bewitched him with her false meekness and calculated innocence, before she had wormed her way into their family like a parasite seeking a host. Ngozi picked up the frame and studied her son's face, remembering the boy she had molded from clay, the man she had shaped through every decision, every connection, every carefully orchestrated step of his rise. He was hers. The empire was hers. And she would not allow some nobody from Enugu to steal what she had spent decades building. Her late husband had been weak, sentimental about legacy and family bloodlines. But Ngozi understood what he never had, that wealth was the only legacy that mattered, and sentiment was a luxury for people who could afford to lose. She set the photograph face down and pulled out her laptop, navigating to a travel website with practiced ease. The flight was easy to find. Lagos to Enugu, then a private car to her ancestral village, departing exactly 2 weeks after Amara's due date. Enough time for the birth to occur, for the automatic transfer to process, for the sale to execute, and for all legal challenges to become meaningless once the money was scattered across 3 continents in accounts no one could trace back to her. She would return to the village not as the widow of a tech mogul but as a queen, building hospitals and schools in her family name, erasing the memory of growing up poor and hungry and desperate. Her finger hovered over the purchase button. Around her, the mansion creaked and settled, the sound of wealth at rest. She thought of Amara asleep upstairs, probably clutching her swollen belly, probably whispering those pathetic prayers about love conquering all. The girl's naivety was almost touching. Almost. Ngozi clicked purchase and watched the confirmation screen load. Then she opened a new tab and searched for something else: accelerants, ignition points, accidental fire statistics in Nigerian homes. She had always believed in having contingency plans. The baby could be born and Amara could continue living, technically speaking. The transfer would still occur. But living witnesses were complicated, especially ones who might eventually realize they'd been poisoned for months, who might start asking questions about clauses and trusts and where exactly the family fortune had disappeared to. It was cleaner, simpler, more permanent if there was an accident. A tragic accident during childbirth, perhaps, or shortly after. The kind of thing that happened to village girls who weren't strong enough for the rigors of motherhood in their condition. She closed the laptop and looked at the photograph of Amara she kept in her desk drawer, not out of affection but out of focus, the way hunters keep pictures of their prey. "That village rat thinks she's won," she whispered to the empty room, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "But she's just a vessel. And vessels break." She picked up her phone one more time and opened her calendar, counting the days until the due date with the precision of someone marking time until an execution. 93 days. 13 weeks. 3 months until everything changed. Outside the study window, Lego slept under a blanket of humidity and smog, the city's lights flickering like distant stars that had forgotten how to guide anyone home. And in her bedroom 3 floors above, Amara turned in her sleep, her hand moving instinctively to protect her belly, unaware that the countdown to her last sunrise had already begun. The call came during breakfast, Emeka's phone vibrating against the table with an urgency that made everyone look up. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from casual to alert in the space of a heartbeat. "It's Minister Adebayo's office," he said, already rising from his chair. "The Abuja contract." He stepped away to take the call, his voice dropping to the clipped, professional tone he used for business that couldn't wait. Amara watched him pace by the window, one hand pressed to his ear, the other gesturing as he spoke. When he returned to the table 5 minutes later, his jaw was tight with the particular tension that meant his day had just been rewritten. "I have to fly to Abuja today. There's an emergency session about the infrastructure bid, and if I'm not in that room, we lose the contract to the Chinese consortium." He was already mentally packing, already halfway out the door. Ngozi set down her teacup with deliberate care, her face arranged in an expression of maternal concern that would have fooled anyone who didn't know the coldness living behind her eyes. "Today? But Emeka, you've been working yourself to exhaustion. Surely someone else can handle." He shook his head, cutting her off gently. "This is 200 billion naira, Mama. Nobody else can handle this." She nodded slowly, then reached across the table to pat his hand. Of course. You're right. You've always been so dedicated, so responsible. Your father would be proud." Her voice carried the weight of blessing, of maternal pride. "Go. Take care of this business. Amara and I will be fine here. Won't we, dear?" She turned to Amara with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Amara nodded because what else could she do, though something in her chest tightened like a fist closing around her heart. Upstairs, Emeka moved through their bedroom with efficient urgency, pulling clothes from the closet, checking his briefcase for documents. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, watching him, her hand resting on her belly where the baby had been unusually quiet this morning. He paused in his packing and really looked at her for the first time in days. The way her collarbones were too prominent, the shadows under her eyes, the tremor in her hands she tried to hide. His face softened with something that looked almost like guilt. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question carried more weight than 3 words should hold. She wanted to tell him everything. About the cold food and the shoves on the stairs, about the arsenic she didn't know was in her meals, about the feeling that lived in her bones now that something terrible was building like storm clouds on a horizon only she could see. But she had learned that men like Emeka, men caught between the women they loved and the mothers who raised them, needed easier truths. So she smiled her practiced smile and said, "I'm fine. Just tired." He studied her a moment longer, something warring behind his eyes, then crossed to his dresser and pulled out a manila envelope from the bottom drawer. He pressed it into her hands with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Don't open this unless something happens to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I mean it, Amara. Only if something happens." Before she could ask what he meant, what could possibly happen, he kissed her forehead, then knelt to kiss her belly, his lips pressing against the curve where their child grew. She felt him whisper something she couldn't hear, words meant only for the baby, and then he was gone, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway like a countdown she didn't know had started. She tucked the envelope into her dresser drawer beneath her clothes, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed it deep into the darkness where secrets lived. From her window, Ngozi watched Emeka's convoy disappear down the palm-lined driveway, the SUVs merging into Lagos traffic until they were just black dots swallowed by the city's chaotic sprawl. Her smile widened slowly, like a crack spreading across ice. She pulled her phone from her wrapper and began making calls, her voice honey-sweet with manufactured generosity. "Patience, my dear, take the day off. Take tomorrow too. Here, I'm sending you something for your trouble. One by one, she dismissed them: the cook who had worked for the family for 15 years, the housekeeper who knew every corner of the mansion, the driver who asked too many questions, the gardener who was always underfoot. She handed out envelopes of cash like benedictions, her explanations practiced and reasonable. She needed quiet to plan a surprise for Emeka's return, she said. She wanted to handle things personally for once, she said. They took the money because domestic staff in Lagos knew better than to refuse when madams offered unexpected generosity, even when something about it felt wrong in ways they couldn't articulate. By noon, the mansion sat empty except for 2 women. One standing at the window watching the last staff member's car pull away, her hand clutching her phone where a one-way ticket to her village glowed on the screen, and one sitting in her bedroom staring at a sealed envelope she'd been told not to open, trying to convince herself that the silence pressing against the walls was normal, that the absence of voices was nothing to fear, that her husband's cryptic warning was simply paranoia born of exhaustion and stress. The house had never felt this quiet. This still. This much like a tomb where something was already dying but hadn't stopped breathing yet. Amara stood and walked to her window, looking out at the garden where bougainvillea bloomed in violent shades of red and purple. She didn't know why, but she found herself heading downstairs, drawn to the garden like something in her blood recognized as the last place she might feel safe, or the first place she would need to fight for her life. Either way, the afternoon sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and fire, and the mansion behind her was emptying of everything except intention, and she was walking toward flowers that looked like spilled blood, unaware that 3 floors above, her mother-in-law was changing out of her expensive wrappers and into practical dark clothing, the kind you wore when you had work to do that couldn't afford witnesses or stains you couldn't explain. The garden had always been Amara's escape, the one corner of the sprawling Banana Island estate where she could breathe without feeling Ngozi's eyes dissecting her every movement. She knelt carefully among the bougainvillea, her pregnant belly making the motion awkward, and ran her fingers over the blood-red petals that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. The flowers were beautiful in a violent way, their colors so saturated they looked almost unreal, like something painted by an artist who understood that beauty and danger often wore the same face. She pruned dead leaves with gentle precision, finding peace in the simple act of tending to something that didn't judge her, didn't find her lacking, didn't wish her gone. The sun was beginning its descent, turning the Lagos sky into layers of amber and crimson and deep purple that matched the bougainvillea blooms. In this light, even the oppressive humidity felt almost merciful, softening the edges of everything. She didn't hear Ngozi approach. She only felt the shift in the air, the way prey senses a predator before understanding why every instinct screams to run. When Amara turned, her mother-in-law stood at the garden entrance, and something was immediately, terribly wrong. Ngozi had changed clothes, gone were the expensive George wrappers and ancestral gold that usually announced her presence like a proclamation of power. Instead, she wore simple dark clothing, practical and unremarkable, the kind of outfit that wouldn't be remembered, wouldn't leave evidence, wouldn't matter if it got dirty. And she was carrying something behind her back, her posture casual but her eyes glittering with an intensity that made Amara's breath catch in her throat. "Amara," Ngozi said, her voice almost kind, almost motherly. "We should talk." The words were an invitation, but they sounded like a sentencing. Amara rose slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby had started kicking as if sensing the danger its mother couldn't yet name. "Yes, Mama," she said, because 6 months of training had taught her that agreement was safer than resistance, that submission bought time even when it cost dignity. Ngozi moved closer, her footsteps slow and measured against the garden stones. She looked around at the bougainvillea, at the high walls that made the space private, at the mansion windows that showed no faces because there was no one left to look. "Beautiful flowers," she said conversationally. "Did you know that in some cultures, red flowers at a funeral symbolize the blood of the deceased? Appropriate, don't you think?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't been lit yet. Amara's pulse quickened, her throat suddenly dry. "Mama, I don't understand." "Don't you?" Ngozi's voice shifted, the kindness evaporating like water on hot stone. Her eyes locked onto Amara's with a hatred so pure it was almost magnificent in its completeness. Let me help you understand, then. Let me explain exactly what you cost me. She began to circle, slowly, the way predators circle wounded prey. Do you know what happens when your bastard is born? Do you know what that child in your belly means? Amara shook her head, backing up slightly, her hand pressed protectively over her stomach. Ngozi laughed, the sound sharp and bitter as broken glass. Of course you don't. Why would my fool of a son tell his village wife about the family trust? About the clause that transfers 50% of his empire to me the moment your brat takes its first breath? The words came faster now, venomous and precise. 50 billion naira, Amara. That's what your pregnancy is worth. And I've already found buyers, Chinese investors who will pay $8 billion for everything. The company, the patents, the contracts, all of it. The world tilted sideways. Amara felt her knees weaken, her vision blurring at the edges as the magnitude of what she was hearing crashed over her like a wave. You're going to sell Emeka's company? Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm going to take what's rightfully mine, Ngozi corrected coldly. What I built. What I sacrificed for. What I manipulated that sentimental fool I married into giving me control of before he died. She stopped circling and stood directly in front of Amara, so close that Amara could smell her perfume mixed with something else, something chemical and wrong. Your baby is my golden ticket, little girl. But you? She smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Amara had ever seen on a human face. You're just the inconvenient packaging. Do you know what you cost me, Amara? Do you know what that child in your belly means? The question was rhetorical, a prelude to violence. That child is worth 50 billion naira to me. But you, she brought her hand from behind her back, and Amara's heart stopped as she saw the red petrol container, the kind used for generators, the kind that could burn hot enough to erase evidence. You're worth nothing but the match that lights you. The container sloshed as Ngozi unscrewed the cap, the sharp chemical smell of petrol flooding the garden and mixing with the sweet scent of bougainvillea. Amara's mind screamed at her to run, but her pregnant body was too slow, too heavy, and Ngozi was already blocking the garden gate. Mama, please, she begged, her voice breaking. Please, I'll leave. I'll disappear. I'll sign anything you want. Just don't hurt the baby. Please, Mama, please. But Ngozi's face was stone, empty of anything resembling mercy or humanity or the capacity for maternal feeling. She raised the container and began to pour, the petrol splashing across Amara's dress in cold waves that soaked through fabric to skin. Amara screamed, stumbling backward, clutching her belly with both hands as if she could shield her unborn child from what was coming. The petrol burned her nostrils, made her eyes water, soaked her hair and ran down her back in rivulets of accelerant. She fell to her knees on the garden stones, the bougainvillea blooming around her like prophecies written in blood, and through her terror and her tears, she looked up at her mother-in-law and saw the matches emerge from Ngozi's pocket, small wooden sticks that could end a life, erase a witness, and clear a path to billions. Mama, she whispered one last time, her voice carrying all the broken prayers of a woman who had believed in patience and grace and love. Please. But Ngozi just smiled, struck one match against the box, and watched it flare to life in the gathering dusk, the small flame reflected in her eyes like hellfire waiting to consume everything in its path. The garden held its breath, the bougainvillea blooms seeming to lean in closer, and Lagos stretched around them in all its indifferent vastness, a city too busy with its own tragedies to notice one more small death in a mansion where wealth couldn't buy mercy and mothers could become monsters without anyone noticing until it was far, far too late. 1 hour earlier, Emeka sat in the back of his Range Rover as it crawled through Lagos traffic, the late afternoon sun beating down on chrome and glass until the whole city shimmered like a mirage built on broken promises. His phone buzzed with the message he'd been dreading: meeting cancelled. Minister Adebayo postponed until next week. Apologies for the inconvenience. He stared at the words, reading them twice, 3 times, waiting for his relief to arrive but finding only a knot of dread tightening in his chest like a fist squeezing his lungs. Something was wrong. He couldn't name it, couldn't point to evidence, but it lived in his bones the way fever announces itself before the thermometer confirms what the body already knows. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Sir, should I turn around to the airport or home?" Emeka said, his voice rough. "Take me home. Now." The envelope arrived 2 days ago, delivered by courier to his office with no return address, just his name written in careful block letters that suggested someone trying not to be identified by their handwriting. Inside were laboratory results from the private medical facility where he'd been secretly sending samples of Amara's food for the past 3 weeks, ever since he'd noticed how her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, how her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that pregnancy alone couldn't explain, how she'd started losing weight despite carrying his child. The words on the clinical report were stark, undeniable, devastating: arsenic detected, 0.8 milligrams per serving. Consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning. Recommend immediate medical intervention and investigation of food source. He'd read those words in his locked office with his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled, and in that moment, everything he thought he knew about his family had cracked open like an egg revealing something rotten inside. His mother. It had to be his mother. The realization didn't come as shock but as confirmation of something he'd been refusing to see for months. The way Ngozi watched Amara with eyes that held not mere contempt but calculation, the way she insisted on overseeing meal preparations, the way she dismissed his concerns with maternal assurances that made him feel like a child questioning his elders. He'd wanted to confront her immediately, but his lawyer had advised caution. "If you accuse her without proof, she'll destroy evidence and claim you're being manipulated by your wife. We need time to build an airtight case." So Emeka had played along, pretending ignorance while secretly transferring assets, restructuring his will, establishing an irrevocable trust that would protect Amara and the baby no matter what happened. He'd moved like a man preparing for war while still hoping peace might somehow prevail. But now, with the Abuja meeting cancelled and every staff member mysteriously dismissed, hope felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. He pulled out his phone and called the house. It rang. And rang. And rang. No answer. He tried Amara's cell, straight to voicemail. His pulse quickened, his palms suddenly slick with sweat despite the air conditioning. He called Patience, the head housekeeper who had worked for his family for 15 years. She answered on the second ring, sounding confused and slightly guilty. "Oga Emeka? But you're in Abuja, no? Where are you, Patience?" His voice came out harder than he intended. "Why aren't you at the house?" "Ah, sir, but Madam Ngozi, she sent all of us home this morning. She give us money, plenty money SEF, and say we should not come back until tomorrow evening. She say she want to surprise you with something special when you return." The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples of dread through his entire body. "All of you? Everyone?" "Yes, sir. Cook, driver, gardener, even security. All of us." Madam was very kind about it, but very firm. "She say." He hung up before she could finish, his mind already racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. An empty house. His mother alone with Amara. The arsenic results. The way Ngozi had been so insistent that he take this trip, so encouraging, so suspiciously supportive. His hands tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. "Faster," he told his driver, his voice barely controlled. "I don't care about traffic. Find a way." The Range Rover swerved into a gap between vehicles, accelerating with aggressive urgency. Emeka opened his phone's security app. He'd installed hidden cameras throughout the mansion 2 weeks ago, small devices disguised as smoke detectors and wall outlets, covering every room except the bedrooms out of respect for privacy that now felt like catastrophic oversight. He pulled up the garden feed first, some instinct guiding his finger to that particular camera. The image was grainy but clear enough. Clear enough to see his mother in dark clothing. Clear enough to see Amara on her knees. Clear enough to see the red petrol container. His world stopped. Just stopped. Everything froze except his heart, which hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest before witnessing what came next. "Sir," his driver's voice seemed to come from very far away. Emeka couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Could only watch the small screen as his mother, the woman who had sung him lullabies, who had raised him, who had shaped every decision of his 43 years, circled his pregnant wife with murder in her movements. His fingers flew across the phone, pulling up the recording function, making sure every second was being captured and backed up to cloud storage because some part of his mind understood that what he was witnessing would require proof that even he would want to deny. Then he opened his security company's emergency contact. His thumbs typed with mechanical precision, "Come to the house. Garden. Now. Silent approach. Do not announce yourselves. Life-threatening emergency." He sent the message and watched the confirmation appear, then looked up at his driver. "I don't care what you have to do. Get me home in the next 10 minutes or I'll drive this car myself." His voice was ice and fire, a tone the driver had never heard from him before, a tone that said everything civilized had just been stripped away to reveal something primal underneath. The Range Rover mounted a curb, cut through a side street, narrowly missed a Danfo bus, and roared toward Banana Island with the desperation of a man who had just realized that all his wealth, all his power, all his calculated precision meant nothing if he couldn't save the one person who had shown him what love looked like when it wasn't transactional. They reached the estate gates just as the sun began its final descent, painting the sky in shades that looked like the world was bleeding. Emeka didn't wait for the gates to fully open. He was out of the car and running before it came to a complete stop, his expensive shoes pounding against marble pathways as he sprinted toward the back entrance, the one the staff used, the one that would bring him to the garden without announcing his presence. He could hear voices now, his mother's cold and sharp as broken glass, and beneath it, Amara's screams. The sound cut through him like a blade, each cry a physical wound. He slowed as he reached the garden wall, forcing himself to move with stealth despite every instinct demanding he crash through like a hurricane. His phone was already out, already recording as he peered around the corner and saw them, his mother with matches in hand, his wife soaked in petrol and begging for mercy that would never come, the bougainvillea blooms framing them like an altar where sacrifices were made to gods that demanded blood. His entire world shattered in that moment. Every memory rewritten, every childhood lesson revealed as manipulation, every story about family honor exposed as a lie built on a foundation of cruelty so profound it had been invisible until it was too late. But he didn't move. Not yet. Because he needed his security team to see this too. He needed witnesses. He needed proof that would hold up in courts and in the tribunal of public opinion. He needed Lagos society to understand that Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo was not a matriarch but a monster, and that monsters didn't deserve mercy just because they'd given birth to you. So he stood in the shadows with his phone recording, watching his mother about to murder his wife, and waited for the moment when intervention would save a life without destroying the evidence that would damn the woman who gave him his. Just as Ngozi raised the matches to strike, something shifted in Amara's body language. A subtle straightening of her spine despite the petrol soaking her dress, despite the terror that should have left her paralyzed, despite 6 months of learning to make herself small and silent and invisible. She stopped begging. The change was so sudden, so complete, that Ngozi actually hesitated, the lit match frozen halfway to the petrol-soaked ground. Amara looked up, and her eyes, those soft eyes that had endured humiliation after humiliation with grace that made saints weep, now burned with something ancient and immovable, something that carried the weight of ancestors who had survived worse than this and lived to see justice prevail. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. It carried instead the authority of a woman who had just remembered she was more than the victim everyone had mistaken her for. "Mama Ngozi," she said, each word measured and deliberate, "you can burn this body. But what you don't know is that 3 days ago, Emeka took me to his lawyer." The match flickered in Ngozi's hand, casting dancing shadows across her face. Her expression twisted from certainty to confusion, confusion to suspicion. What are you talking about? Her voice had lost some of its cold confidence, and they both heard it. Amara rose slowly to her feet, petrol dripping from her dress onto the garden stones, creating a pool of accelerant around her like a moat she'd somehow learned to command rather than fear. Her hand remained protectively over her belly, but her posture was no longer that of prey. He's been testing my food, Mama. 4 weeks. Every meal you prepared so carefully, every dish you insisted I eat, he sent samples to a private laboratory. She watched Ngozi's face pale, watched understanding begin to dawn like a sunrise that promised not light but exposure. They found arsenic. 0.8 milligrams per serving. Chronic low-dose poisoning, the report said. Enough to make me weak, to make the baby weak, to perhaps cause a miscarriage that would look like natural causes. How long have you been poisoning me, Mama? Since the wedding? Since you realized I was pregnant? Ngozi's hand trembled now, the match burning closer to her fingers. You're lying. You're making this up too. He's already changed his will, Amara continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, each piece of truth she'd been carrying like weapons she'd finally learned to wield. Everything, the company, the assets, the trust you manipulated his father into creating, it's all been restructured. He's transferred everything into an irrevocable trust for our unborn child, with me as sole trustee until the child turns 21. She took a step forward, and impossibly, Ngozi took a step back. Which means even if you kill me today, even if you kill this baby, you'll never see 1 kobo of his money. The trust is irrevocable, Mama. That means it cannot be undone. Cannot be challenged. Cannot be touched by you or anyone else. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but held a fierce satisfaction that was far more powerful. Your Chinese investors? Your $8 billion? Your one-way ticket to the village? All of it, worthless. The match burned down to Ngozi's fingers and she dropped it with a curse, the small flame extinguishing as it hit the ground. But she had more matches, her hand already reaching into her pocket. You're lying, she hissed, but her voice carried desperation now instead of certainty. Emeka would never, he would have told me. I'm his mother. I control. You control nothing, Amara interrupted, and the power in those 3 words seemed to physically push Ngozi backward. You think you're the only one who knows how to plan? You think because I'm from a village, because I'm soft-spoken, because I endured your cruelty with grace, that I'm stupid? Naive? She laughed, and the sound was bitter and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Emeka suspected you were poisoning me 3 weeks ago. He suspected, and he acted. While you were booking your flights and negotiating with investors, he was meeting with lawyers. While you were planning my murder, he was protecting our child from you. And the cameras, Mama. Amara's voice dropped to something almost tender, almost pitying. Did you really think there were no cameras? A man as wealthy as Emeka, as careful as Emeka, and you thought this mansion had no security recording every corner? She gestured around the garden, at the walls, at the mansion looming behind them. He has cameras everywhere. In the kitchen where you prepared my poisoned food. In the hallways where you shoved me on the stairs. In this garden where you're trying to burn me alive. She took another step forward, and Ngozi stumbled backward, the predator-prey dynamic reversing so completely it was almost dizzying. Which means even if you succeed, even if you light that match and watch me burn, you'll die in prison. Not in your village as the wealthiest woman in Igbo land. In a Lagos prison cell where they know what to do with women who murder pregnant girls for money. For a long moment, the garden held its breath. The bougainvillea blooms seemed to lean in, bearing witness. The Lagos sky continued its descent into darkness, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding beneath it. And then something in Ngozi's face collapsed, not into remorse or shame or anything resembling human feeling, but into pure animalistic rage. The careful mask of civilization, the elegant matriarch, the respected chief, all of it fell away to reveal something feral underneath. If I can't have the money, she snarled, her voice raw and stripped of pretense, then I'll have revenge. She struck another match, and this time her hand didn't tremble. This time the murder in her eyes was personal, not calculated. This time she lunged forward with a lit flame, not caring about consequences or cameras or prison, caring only about the primal need to destroy the thing that had dared to defy her. Behind the garden wall, Emeka watched his wife's extraordinary courage, watched her stand tall in the face of death, watched her speak truth to power with a strength he hadn't known she possessed. And he watched his mother. The woman who had raised him, shaped him, controlled every aspect of his life for 43 years, lunge forward with murder blazing in her eyes and a lit match in her hand. The security team was still 3 minutes away. 3 minutes that Amara didn't have. So Emeka made his choice. He exploded from the shadows with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion, a sound that carried 43 years of willful blindness transformed in an instant into protective fury. His body moved before his mind could process, tackling his mother at a full sprint, his shoulder connecting with her chest and driving her backward away from Amara. The match flew from Ngozi's hand, arcing through the air in slow motion before landing harmlessly in the dirt outside the petrol-soaked area. Mother and son crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, and Ngozi screamed, not in pain but in rage and disbelief, thrashing like a demon being exorcised by holy water. "Emeka!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and breaking. "What are you doing?" "I'm your mother." You're a monster," he said quietly, pinning her arms as she struggled beneath him. His voice was steady despite the tears streaming down his face, steady despite his entire world collapsing around him. "You're a monster, and I watched you. I saw everything." Amara stood frozen, her body shaking with adrenaline and shock, unable to process that she was still alive, that the flames hadn't come, that her husband had appeared like something from a dream. Emeka looked at her over his shoulder, his eyes finding hers across the petrol-soaked space between them. "Don't move," he said gently. "The security team is coming. Just stay still, my love. Stay still." Then he pulled his phone from his pocket with one hand while keeping his mother pinned with the other, and held it up so Ngozi could see the screen. "Every word," he said. "Every confession about the trust clause, the Chinese investors, the planned murder, all of it recorded. And uploaded to cloud storage. And already sent to my lawyers." His voice broke on the last words. "Why, Mama? Why?" But Ngozi didn't answer. She just stared at her son with eyes that held not regret but calculation, even now measuring whether there was still an angle to play, still a way to win. And in that moment, Emeka understood that she was exactly what Amara had called her. A monster who wore his mother's face, and the worst kind of monster because she'd been hiding in plain sight for his entire life, and he'd been too afraid or too loyal or too blinded by filial duty to see her for what she truly was until she'd forced his hand by trying to burn his wife alive in their garden while bougainvillea blooms watched like silent witnesses to the death of everything he'd believed about family and love and the difference between the two. The matches scattered across the garden stones like fallen stars, their small wooden bodies harmless now but still carrying the promise of what they'd almost done. Security guards flooded through the garden gate, 6 men in black uniforms moving with practiced efficiency, their faces carefully neutral despite the scene before them that would be seared into their memories forever. Emeka slowly released his mother and stood, his legs unsteady beneath him as adrenaline drained and left only exhaustion and grief so profound it felt like physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. 2 guards moved to restrain Ngozi, pulling her to her feet with professional courtesy that seemed absurd given the circumstances. She didn't resist, but her face had transformed into something terrible. Not remorse or shock but cold fury directed entirely at her son, as if he were the betrayer in this equation, as if his intervention had been the true crime committed here today. Emeka moved toward Amara, who stood trembling in her petrol-soaked dress, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly, her face streaked with tears and dirt and the residue of terror that would take years to fully wash away. He wanted to hold her but was afraid. Afraid the petrol would ignite from static electricity, afraid his touch would shatter whatever strength was holding her together, afraid that if he acknowledged the full horror of what had almost happened he would collapse entirely. Instead, he shrugged off his jacket with shaking hands and draped it carefully over her shoulders, his fingers not quite touching her skin. "You're safe now," he whispered, though the words felt inadequate, felt like trying to hold back the ocean with a paper cup. "I've got you. You're safe." She nodded but didn't speak, her eyes distant and glassy with shock. He turned to the head of security. "Get the garden hose. We need to wash the petrol off her carefully, no pressure, just gentle water. And call an ambulance. I want her and the baby checked immediately." Then he approached his mother, and the guard stepped back slightly, creating space for whatever needed to happen next between his son and the woman who had given him life and then tried to take his wife's. Ngozi stood with her hands restrained behind her back, her expensive jewelry catching the last light of the setting sun, her face a mask of imperious rage. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. 43 years of history stretching between them like a bridge that had just been burned to ash. "Mama," he said quietly, and his voice held devastation that went deeper than anger. "Why?" She laughed, actually laughed, the sound sharp and bitter as poison. "Why? You dare ask me why? I built this empire. Me. While your father played with his technology toys and his idealistic nonsense about integrity and fair business practices, I was the one making the real deals, securing the real power. I manipulated, I negotiated, I did what was necessary to make us wealthy beyond imagination. And you," her voice dripped with contempt, "you were going to throw it all away on that village rat? Her name is Amara." His voice was steady now, cold as winter in places that never knew snow. "And she's worth more than this entire empire." Ngozi spat at his feet. "She's nobody. A teacher from nowhere with nothing to offer but her womb. I gave you everything. Education, connections, the foundation to build your fortune, and this is how you repay me? By choosing her over your own mother?" Emeka shook his head slowly, and something in his expression made even the guards shift uncomfortably. "You didn't give me an empire, Mama. You gave me a lie." He pulled his phone out again, scrolling through files until he found what he was looking for. "Do you want to know the real poison? The real betrayal?" His fingers trembled as he held up the screen. "Amara isn't who you think she is." The confusion that flashed across Ngozi's face was the first genuine emotion Emeka had seen from her all evening. "What are you talking about?" He looked at Amara, who nodded almost imperceptibly, giving him permission to speak the truth they'd been carrying like a loaded weapon, waiting for exactly this moment. "Tell her," Amara said softly, her voice still shaking but clear. "Tell her who my father was." Emeka turned back to his mother, and his next words came out measured and precise, each syllable a nail in the coffin of everything the Okonkwo family pretended to be. "Her father was Chief Obi Ezenwada." "Does that name sound familiar, Mama?" He watched the color drain from Ngozi's face, watched her lips part in silent shock. 20 years ago, you and Papa stole his land patents, 200 acres of prime real estate in Lekki that should have made his family wealthy for generations. You forged documents, bribed government officials, and when Chief Ezenwada tried to fight back, you destroyed him. Systematically. Professionally. You bankrupted him, discredited him, and drove him to hang himself in his study while his wife and daughter found him. The garden had gone completely silent except for the sound of water from the hose washing petrol off Amara's dress, the liquid running in dark streams across the garden stones like the truth finally flowing free after being dammed up for decades. Ngozi's face had transformed from rage to something approaching horror, not because of remorse but because she was finally understanding the trap she'd walked into. His widow cursed you on her deathbed, Emeka continued, his voice gaining strength. She said your own blood would bring you to justice. That the seed you planted in cruelty would harvest your destruction. I thought it was just the ramblings of a grieving woman. But Amara. He gestured to his wife, who stood now wrapped in his jacket with water dripping from her hair, looking like a warrior who had survived her own execution. She found me 2 years ago. She had documents, proof of everything you and Papa did. She showed me the forged signatures, the bribed officials, the trail of corruption that built the foundation of Okonkwo Tech Enterprises. We've been building a case, Amara added, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, as if telling the truth was returning her power one word at a time. Working with lawyers, gathering evidence, preparing to restore my family's name and return what was stolen. It was supposed to be revenge. Pure and simple. Justice for my father who died believing he was a failure, for my mother who spent her last years in poverty because of what you took from us. She stepped forward, and despite everything, despite the petrol still clinging to her skin and the terror she just survived, her presence commanded the space. But then something unexpected happened. I fell in love with him. She looked at Emeka with such tenderness it made the guards look away. With his kindness. His integrity. The way he was nothing like his parents despite being raised by them. And he fell in love with me. Not knowing who I was, not knowing about the revenge I'd planned, just loving me for myself. Emeka picked up the story, his hand reaching out to take Amara's across the space between them. When she told me the truth 3 months into our relationship, I had a choice. I could defend my parents' legacy and lose the only real thing I'd ever had. Or I could acknowledge that my empire was built on bones and theft and do what my father should have done 20 years ago, make it right. His voice hardened as he turned back to Ngozi. So yes, I married her. Not for revenge, but because she showed me what real wealth looks like. Character. Forgiveness. The strength to seek justice without becoming the monster you're fighting against. He pulled up another document on his phone. I've already begun transferring the Lecky properties back to Amara's family trust. The land patents will be restored. And the portion of our wealth that came directly from that theft, estimated at 40% of the current company value, will go to a restitution fund for everyone you and Papa destroyed on your way to the top. Ngozi's legs seemed to give out, and the guards had to hold her upright. Her face had gone from rage to disbelief to something that looked almost like recognition, not of wrongdoing, but of defeat. She stared at Amara with new eyes, seeing not a village girl but the daughter of a ghost, the instrument of a curse she'd dismissed as superstition, the living embodiment of consequences she'd thought she could outrun forever. The widow's curse, she whispered. Your own blood will bring you to justice. She looked at Emeka, then at Amara's belly where her grandchild grew. The baby. Your blood and hers. Ezenwada's blood and Okonkwo blood mixed. That's the justice. That's the... Her voice broke, not with remorse but with the horrible understanding that she'd been outmaneuvered not by strategy but by the universe's sense of poetic symmetry. I didn't marry her for revenge, Emeka repeated, his voice cracking with emotion. I married her because she taught me that you can seek justice without losing your soul. That forgiveness and accountability aren't opposites, they're partners. That you can restore what was stolen without becoming a thief yourself. He looked at his mother, and his face held such profound sadness it was almost harder to witness than rage would have been. But you, Mama, you were willing to burn an innocent woman alive for money. Not for survival, not for protection, but for greed. You poisoned her for months, plotted her murder, and when she stood up to you, you lunged at her with a lit match. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You're not my mother anymore. Whatever woman raised me, whatever woman I loved. She died the moment you poured that petrol. And I don't know if she ever really existed or if I just invented her because children need to believe their parents are capable of love. Behind them, sirens began to wail in the distance, the sound cutting through the thick Lagos evening like a promise that justice, however imperfect, however delayed, was finally arriving. Ngozi stood there restrained by security guards, her perfect makeup starting to run with sweat and tears. She probably didn't even realize she was crying, looking nothing like the powerful matriarch who had ruled the Banana Island mansion just hours ago. And as the sirens grew louder and the bougainvillea blooms seemed to glow blood red in the fading light, Emeka realized that this was what generational trauma looked like when it finally broke. Messy and painful and necessary, like bones that had healed wrong and needed to be broken again to set properly, like curse lifted not through magic but through the simple revolutionary act of choosing truth over loyalty, justice over comfort, and love over the empire built on other people's destruction. The police sirens crescendoed and then stopped abruptly as 3 vehicles pulled through the estate gates, their blue lights painting the garden walls in rhythmic waves of official authority that felt both like salvation and like the final nail in the coffin of everything the Okonkwo family had pretended to be. Ngozi stood restrained between 2 security guards, and as the police officers approached with handcuffs gleaming in the dying light, something seemed to crack in her carefully maintained facade. Not remorse, she was incapable of that, but the terrible realization that her story was ending in a Lagos police station instead of in a village shrine where she would have been worshipped as the wealthiest woman in living memory. "I'm your mother," she said suddenly, her voice breaking as she looked at Emeka with something that might have been desperation if it hadn't been so thoroughly calculated. "I raised you. I sacrificed everything for you. You gave me lies, Mama," Emeka interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "You built everything I am on bones. On stolen land and forged documents and the suicide of a good man whose only crime was trusting that the law would protect him from people like you." The lead police officer, a weathered woman with captain's insignia and eyes that had seen too much of Lagos's darkness to be shocked by anything, stepped forward with papers in hand. "Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo?" Her voice was professionally neutral, but there was something almost satisfied in the way she said the name, as if corrupt matriarchs being brought to justice was a rare enough occurrence to be savored. "Yes," Ngozi said, drawing herself up with as much dignity as someone restrained and caught in attempted murder could manage. "I am Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo, and I demand to speak with my lawyer. This is a misunderstanding. My son is confused. That woman has manipulated." "Ma'am," the captain cut her off with the kind of tired authority that came from years of hearing wealthy people explain why laws didn't apply to them. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it." She nodded to her officers, who moved forward with handcuffs that clicked shut around Ngozi's wrists with a sound that was both final and strangely musical, like a lock closing on a chapter that should have ended decades ago. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, theft, forgery, and we'll add more charges as we review the evidence Mr. Okonkwo has provided." The captain glanced at Emeka, who nodded and held up his phone showing the recorded confession, the video footage, the documented proof of months of poisoning. "We have everything we need for initial charges. The investigation will uncover more, I'm sure." She turned back to Ngozi and began reading the formal charges in a voice that reduced 50 years of crime and cruelty to legal terminology that sounded almost mundane. "You are charged with the attempted murder of Amara Okonkwo, 6 months pregnant. With conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. With the systematic poisoning of said Amara Okonkwo using arsenic over a period of approximately 12 weeks. With fraud relating to the manipulation of legal documents to secure unauthorized control of corporate assets. With theft dating back 20 years involving land patents belonging to Chief Obi Ezenwada and his heirs." "Stop," Ngozi hissed, but the word had no power anymore, was just sound without authority. The captain continued without pause. "And with conspiracy to commit securities fraud through the planned unauthorized sale of Okonkwo Tech Enterprises to foreign investors using illegally obtained corporate control." She paused, meeting Ngozi's eyes. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, which I doubt given your circumstances, one will be provided to you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them?" For a long moment, Ngozi just stared at her, and then slowly, impossibly, she began to laugh. It started as a chuckle and built into something that sounded almost like hysteria, though her eyes remained calculating even as her mouth shaped mirth. "Do I understand? Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand that my own son has chosen a village nobody over his own mother. I understand that I'm being arrested for doing what was necessary to protect what I built. I understand that you're all too stupid to see that she jerked her head toward Amara, that she's the real criminal here. She seduced my son, manipulated him, turned him against his own family for revenge. Mama. Emeka's voice cut through her tirade like a blade, and something in his tone made even the police officers fall silent. He walked toward his mother slowly, his footsteps measured and deliberate against the garden stones. When he stood before her, his face held not anger but a grief so profound it seemed to age him a decade in the space of seconds. I begged you, he said softly, and his voice cracked on the words. Not out loud, not directly, but in every way I knew how. I hired new cooks hoping you'd stop poisoning her food. I installed cameras hoping the surveillance would make you reconsider. I started testing her meals and sent the results to my lawyer hoping that the threat of exposure would make you step back from whatever edge you were walking toward. Tears streamed down his face now, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. I gave you so many chances to choose differently. To be the mother I needed you to be instead of the monster you actually are. And you looked at every single one of those chances and decided that 50 billion naira was worth more than your son's happiness. Worth more than an innocent woman's life. Worth more than your own grandchild. Ngozi's face twisted with contempt. That child is contaminated. Half Ezenwada blood. The offspring of the man we destroyed. You think I could ever accept? I know you couldn't, Emeka said, cutting her off. That's why you poisoned Amara in the first place. Not just for the money, but because you couldn't stand the thought of Ezenwada's grandchild carrying the Okonkwo name. You wanted to cause a miscarriage and blame it on her weak village constitution. And when that didn't work fast enough, when the baby proved stronger than your poison, you decided to eliminate them both and make it look like an accident. He stepped back, and his next words came out with the finality of a judge passing sentence. You're not my mother anymore. Whatever woman raised me, whatever woman I thought loved me, if she ever existed, she's gone now. And I will testify against you at trial. I will show the courts every piece of evidence. I will make sure that you spend whatever years you have left in prison, not in your village being worshipped, but in a cell where you can't hurt anyone else. The officers began to lead Ngozi away, her designer shoes clicking against the pathway that led from the garden to the driveway where the police vehicles waited with their doors open like mouths ready to swallow her whole. But she twisted back, her voice rising to a shriek that echoed across the mansion grounds. I'm your mother. I raised you. I gave you everything. You can't do this to me. Emeka. Emeka. The sound of her voice grew fainter as they guided her into the back of a police vehicle, her protests muffled by closing doors and distance. And then there was silence except for the sound of water still trickling from the garden hose and the soft crying of Amara, who had been holding herself together through sheer will and was now finally allowing herself to collapse under the weight of survival. Emeka rushed to her, catching her as her legs gave out, carefully mindful of the petrol still clinging to her dress despite the water. I've got you, he whispered into her hair, his voice hoarse. I've got you. She can never hurt you again. Never. Amara sobbed against his chest, her whole body shaking with trauma and relief and the peculiar grief that comes from realizing you were seconds away from death and somehow survived. The baby, she managed through tears. Is the baby? The ambulance is coming, he assured her, his hand moving to rest gently on her belly where their child grew, where Ezenwada blood and Okonkwo blood had already mixed despite all Ngozi's attempts to prevent it, creating a future neither family could have imagined and both desperately needed. We'll get you both checked. Everything's going to be okay. The captain approached them, her expression softening slightly. Mrs. Okonkwo, I know this is difficult, but we'll need a formal statement. Not tonight, you need medical attention first, but in the next few days. Amara nodded weakly. The captain hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, what you did back there, standing up to her, buying time until help arrived, that took extraordinary courage. Amara looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt and the residue of horror. My father taught me that carrying hate is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die, she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a philosophy that had kept her soul intact through months of abuse. "Mama, I forgive you," she said toward the driveway where Ngozi had disappeared, though the words were clearly meant for herself more than for the woman who would never understand them. "Because my father taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean you escape consequences. It means I can watch justice unfold without bitterness eating my soul." The captain nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in her tired eyes. "That's wisdom most people spend their whole lives trying to learn." She turned to Emeka. "Mr. Okonkwo, the evidence you provided is substantial. Given the attempted murder, the poisoning, and the financial crimes, we'll be recommending maximum charges. With the video and audio recordings, this is about as open and shut as cases get. But you should prepare yourself, the trial will be public. Lagos society will tear your family apart in the press. There will be people who defend your mother, who claim you've been manipulated, who say, 'I don't care,'" Emeka said simply. "Let them say whatever they want. The truth is the truth, and it doesn't need permission to exist." He looked down at Amara, who had quieted now, her breathing steadying against his chest. "She's right. Forgiveness doesn't mean escape from consequences. My mother will face justice. And I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of woman Chief Mrs. Ngozi Okonkwo really is, not the philanthropist or the society matriarch or the respected widow, but the woman who poisoned her pregnant daughter-in-law and tried to burn her alive for money she didn't even need." In the distance, an ambulance siren began its approach, adding another layer of sound to the evening that had already held too much: screams and confessions and handcuffs clicking shut and the terrible silence that comes after violence is interrupted but before healing can begin. The bougainvillea blooms glowed blood-red in the garden lights that had automatically activated with the approaching darkness, beautiful and violent and indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded beneath their branches. And as Emeka held his wife and waited for the paramedics to arrive, as police officers secured the scene and took photographs of evidence that would put his mother away for decades, as Lagos stretched around them in all its chaotic vastness, he realized that this was what redemption looked like when it finally arrived. Not clean or simple or triumphant, but messy and painful and necessary, like surgery that cuts away disease to save the patient, like truth that destroys in order to heal, like justice that requires you to testify against your own blood because sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who were supposed to protect you, and the only way forward is through the wreckage they created, carrying the pieces that still work toward a future they tried their hardest to destroy.
3 months later, Amara stood in a Lagos courtroom that smelled of old wood and bureaucratic patience, her belly now swollen to 9 months, her body heavy with the weight of a child who had survived poison and petrol and a grandmother's hatred before even taking a first breath. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s whose face suggested she'd presided over enough family betrayals to fill libraries, looked over her reading glasses at the documents spread before her. In the matter of the estate of Chief Obi Ezenwada versus the Okonkwo Family Trust, she began, her voice carrying the formal cadence of legal closure, this court finds that the land patents in question were obtained through fraud, forgery, and bribery. The original 200 acres of Lekki real estate, now valued at approximately 12 billion naira, are hereby returned to the Ezenwada Family Trust with full restitution for 20 years of lost income, estimated at an additional 4 billion naira. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder condensed into a single wooden strike. Amara's hand trembled as she signed the papers that restored her father's name, that officially acknowledged what everyone in the courtroom already knew. That Chief Obi Ezenwada had been a good man destroyed by people who confused wealth with worth and power with permission to harm. The money didn't bring him back. Nothing could do that. But his name was cleared now, carved into official record as victim rather than failure, and that mattered in ways that transcended currency. Your father would be proud, the judge said quietly, at a rare moment of personal connection breaking through professional distance. Not just of this outcome, but of how you achieved it, with evidence and patience instead of vengeance. That takes character rare enough to be remarkable. Amara nodded, unable to speak past the emotion lodged in her throat like a stone made of grief and vindication in equal measure. Emeka stood beside her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back, and when their eyes met, the understanding that passed between them needed no words. That evening, as the sun set over Lagos in shades of orange and purple that made the city look almost gentle, Amara's water broke. The contractions started slowly, then built with the inexorable rhythm of nature asserting itself over human drama and legal proceedings and all the complicated machinery of justice that had consumed the past 3 months. Emeka drove her to the hospital with the kind of controlled panic that made her laugh despite the pain, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his voice steady as he called ahead to make sure everything was ready. "You're doing great," he kept saying, though she wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. "Everything's going to be fine. You're the strongest person I know. You survived my mother. Labor should be easy after that." She laughed again, then gasped as another contraction hit, her hand squeezing his so hard she thought she might break bones. The labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of pain that was nothing like the slow poison of arsenic or the sudden terror of petrol-soaked confrontation, but its own kind of ordeal that women had been enduring since the beginning of time. Emeka stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragements that probably annoyed her more than they helped but which she needed anyway. And when their daughter finally emerged, screaming and perfect and furious at being pulled from the warm darkness into Lagos's fluorescent hospital lights, Amara held her against her chest and wept with a joy so pure it felt like being washed clean of everything that had come before. "Chioma," she whispered, the name they'd chosen meaning "good God" in Igbo, a declaration of faith despite everything. "Your name is Chioma." Emeka looked down at his daughter, at the tiny face that held features from both families, Ezenwada and Okonkwo mixed in ways that made prophecies and curses irrelevant compared to the simple miracle of new life, and something in his chest cracked open. Not breaking, but expanding to hold more love than he'd known was possible. He touched the baby's tiny hand, watched her fingers curl instinctively around his thumb, and understood in that moment what his mother had never grasped. That wealth was measured not in bank accounts or land patents or corporate valuations, but in these small perfect fingers that held his, with absolute trust. "Hello, Chioma," he said softly. "Welcome to a world that's going to be better than the one your grandmother tried to create." Amara looked up at him with exhausted eyes that still managed to hold mischief. No pressure on her, though. He laughed, the sound surprising both of them with its lightness. No pressure. Just love, and truth, and the chance to choose better than we were taught. Later, when Amara had been moved to a recovery room and Chioma slept in the bassinet beside her bed, Amara held her daughter close and whispered words meant only for the tiny ears that couldn't yet understand their weight. "Your grandmother Ngozi chose greed," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Your grandfather Ezenwada chose integrity. You carry both bloodlines, my love. Okonkwo and Ezenwada mixed in your veins like a treaty written in DNA. You'll face choices throughout your life about which legacy to honor, the one that takes or the one that gives, the one that poisons or the one that heals, the one that burns or the one that builds." She kissed the baby's forehead, breathing in that particular new human smell that was somehow both foreign and familiar. "Choose wisely, little one. Choose with your heart, but also with your eyes wide open. And remember that forgiveness and justice aren't opposites. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth, even when the truth destroys everything you thought you knew about family." 6 months after Chioma's birth, Emeka and Amara moved into a new home. Not the sprawling Banana Island mansion that had been sold to pay restitution to the dozens of people and families the Okonkwos had defrauded over decades, but a modest compound in Ikoyi with high walls covered in bougainvillea that Amara had planted herself. The flowers bloomed in the same violent shades of red and purple that had witnessed her near death, but here they meant something different. Here they were reclamation rather than reminder, beauty she'd chosen rather than beauty that had framed her attempted murder. She tended them carefully, while Chioma napped in a carrier on her back, humming songs her father had taught her in a village that seemed both very far away and carried with her in every breath. Emeka rebuilt his company from scratch, this time on foundations of transparency and ethics that would have baffled his parents, but which made him sleep better at night. He donated 40% of the company's value to a restitution fund that would spend the next 20 years tracking down and compensating everyone his parents had destroyed. The rest he ran with the kind of integrity his father had occasionally preached but never practiced, proving that it was possible to be successful without being cruel, wealthy without being corrupt, powerful without being poisonous. Lagos society whispered about his downfall, about the billionaire who had betrayed his own mother, but he didn't care. He'd learned that reputation built on lies was worse than no reputation at all, and that the people worth keeping in your life were the ones who stayed after the truth came out. Ngozi's trial lasted 3 weeks and ended with a guilty verdict on all counts. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, forgery, theft, and a litany of other charges that, when read aloud, took nearly 10 minutes to complete. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15. She'd be 93 if she survived to see freedom again, ancient and forgotten by the society that had once feared and respected her in equal measure. Emeka attended the sentencing, but didn't speak to her. There was nothing left to say. She looked at him across the courtroom with eyes that held not remorse but calculation even then, probably planning appeals and strategies and ways to manipulate the system from inside its walls. Some people never changed. Some monsters just wore different costumes depending on what stage they found themselves on. On a Sunday morning 6 months after the trial, Amara sat in her garden with Chioma on her lap, the baby now old enough to grab at flowers and laugh at butterflies that landed on the bougainvillea blooms. Emeka joined them with coffee, settling onto the bench beside his wife, his daughter, his chosen family that had replaced the one he'd been born into. The Lagos sun beat down with its usual intensity, but here in the garden with walls high enough to keep out judgment and flowers bright enough to drown out memory, they had built something that felt almost like peace. "Do you ever regret it?" Amara asked suddenly, the question that had been living under her tongue for months finally finding its way into the air between them. Testifying against her? Watching your own mother go to prison? Emeka was quiet for a long moment, watching Chioma try to eat a purple bougainvillea petal that Amara gently extracted from her tiny fist. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that she made choices that forced me to choose between protecting you or protecting her. But no, I don't regret choosing you. I don't regret choosing truth. I don't regret choosing our daughter's future over my mother's freedom to harm." He took Amara's hand, threading his fingers through hers. "She taught me that blood doesn't make you family. Character does. Choices do. And the way you treat the people who have no power over you, that's what reveals who you really are." Amara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of survival that still sometimes surprised her when she woke up in the mornings. "My father used to say that carrying hate is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die." "You've told me," Emeka said gently, "many times." "I know, but I think I'm finally starting to understand what he meant. Not just intellectually, but in my bones." She gestured around the garden, at the home they'd built, at the daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. This is what forgiveness looks like when it's real, not pretending the harm didn't happen, not excusing the cruelty, but choosing not to let the person who hurt you define the rest of your life. "Your mother tried to kill me, and I survived. And now I get to live, really live, while she sits in a cell. That's justice and healing happening at the same time. That's the curse fulfilled and broken simultaneously." The voiceover that would later narrate their story spoke in the voice of ancestors and witnesses and everyone who had ever believed that wealth could substitute for character. No amount of wealth, status, or family name can protect you from the seeds you plant. Cruelty harvests shame, greed harvests emptiness, and the very victim you underestimate may be the instrument of divine justice, carrying the truth that sets everything right. For in the end, character is the only inheritance that truly matters, and those who build empires on wickedness will watch them crumble by the hands they most despised. The words hung in the air like a benediction, like a warning, like a promise that the universe kept even when humans tried to break it. The final image was this: Amara in her garden, bougainvillea blooming around her in the same violent shades of red and purple that had once framed her near-death, but now framed her resurrection. Chioma in her arms, chubby and perfect and carrying both family names without shame because her parents had chosen to redeem rather than repeat the sins of their fathers. And Emeka's hand resting gently on Amara's shoulder, the three of them forming a triangle of chosen family that was stronger than blood, more sacred than wealth, more permanent than empires built on theft and lies. The garden that had been the site of attempted murder was now the symbol of rebirth. Justice served. Forgiveness offered. Legacy redeemed. And somewhere in the background, almost imperceptible but undeniably present, the sound of Lagos continuing its chaotic symphony. Car horns and market vendors, and the eternal hustle of a city that never stopped moving long enough to notice when small miracles happened in hidden gardens where flowers bloomed like promises that some things, despite everything, were still worth believing in.